Page 30. Thoughts emerge not only from inner stimuli, rather they also form themselves in the consciousness as a result of external perceptions, as a result of the external world of circumstances, as a result of which the inner world of the thoughts comes about. And just as the thoughts which emerge from inside can be negative or positive, good or bad, or pleasant or unpleasant, so it is also with the thoughts which are produced through the perception of the world of external circumstances. Therefore, thoughts which come into being in the inside, as well as thoughts which arise as a result of external influences and external circumstances, are factors which are among the human being's greatest individual possessions. Namely, as a result of the thoughts which contain power and might in themselves, he or she is able to master or destroy his or her life. Whether the thoughts are negative or neutral positive equalized, they always generate an effect which corresponds to them. And as a result, the human being always hauls in the return which he or she draws as a gain out of his or her thinking. Pain, suffering, grievances, burdening, vexation, worry, melancholy, affliction, tribulation, misfortune, strain, and distress, and so on and so forth, or joy, happiness, peace, harmony, well-being, pleasure, bliss, freedom from pain, gaiety, cheerfulness, liberation, elation, and love. If the human being follows his or her inner thoughts, hopes, desires, and wishes, then he or she gives his or her own domination free rein and thereby ultimately reaches their fulfillment, and indeed in the external conditions of life as well as in his or her inner, in his or her psyche, morality, character, and entire personality. This corresponds to the law of the growth, of the progress, and to the law of the adaptation of all things to each other, two laws which have their validity everywhere. That which the human being thinks, he or she makes real, and that which the human being thinks about himself or herself, he or she becomes. Therefore, in any case, it is absolutely always necessary that good and positive thoughts are tended and nurtured, and that the human being also holds a good and positive opinion of himself or herself. An opinion arises from thoughts, and these are equipped with might. Consequently, they can be realized because of the might. Therefore, an opinion is as full of might as are the thoughts themselves, for which reason it is necessary to have a realistic opinion of oneself as well as of reality, because only such an opinion is good and positive. And just as one's own thoughts are the most important, so also is one's own opinion the most important in regard to oneself. Therefore, every human being should be intent on fathoming his or her own self, and forming an opinion of himself or herself which relates to reality and which corresponds to the actual facts. With that, it is not allowed that others inject their opinion, because one's own opinion about one's own personality can only be formed completely according to reality when no outside influences, in the form of the opinions of others, play a part. To this end, the following is important. With the forming of an opinion in regard to his or her actual personality, the human being should have no thoughts about the opinion of others, rather only thoughts about himself or herself, about his or her character, morality, and true, quote, I, as well as about life and death and the fulfillment of the evolution. The human being always determines and forges his or her own destiny. Consequently, he or she never ends in the gutter or in Gaul as a result of the tyranny and terror of an imposed destiny determined by others, or as a result of some kind of circumstances beyond his or her control, rather solely as a result of the might of his or her thoughts, through which the way through life and the circumstances of life are determined. Lower thoughts, wishes, desires, and yearnings, and so forth, lead to lower results. However, healthy, higher, and neutral positive equalized thoughts bring positive success. Therefore, no human being with pure and positively formed thoughts slips down into negative paths, or even paths which equate to negative Ausartung, if suddenly a bad, negative, purely external pressure powerfully demands that which is evil, bad, or negative, and perhaps even demands a crime. If a human being becomes a criminal, a felon, a miser, depraved, virtuous, jealous, vengeful, or a hater, and so forth, then he or she has already maintained the corresponding thoughts in his or her consciousness for a long time, whereby he or she only waits until the opportune hour arrives to set free the power collected in all negative Ausartung. Therefore, the circumstances do not make the human being a gutter dweller, a criminal, and one afflicted with other terrible things. Rather, it is the human being, himself or herself, with the might of his or her thoughts, which come to fruition. The human being thereby bears himself or herself not only before his or her fellow human beings, rather first and foremost before himself or herself. In fact, the creational laws are formed in such a way that there are no powers aside from the human being's own thoughts from which he or she could come to experience personal inequity and personal suffering, as well as misery and affliction. Aside from one's own negative inclinations, wishes, and desires, no circumstances are able to cloud one's own, "I" consciousness and psyche. So, there are also no circumstances, however, which would or could lead to the true virtue, as well as to effective success and feelings of happiness, without a constant cultivation with virtuous efforts and hopes. Solely the might of the thoughts is able to form everything and allow it to become reality, consciously or unconsciously. That which is thought fulfills itself sooner or later. Therefore, the human being is always lord and master of his or her own thinking, and is thereby also creator of his or her own self. Just as the human being is architect and owner-builder of his or her surroundings and the external world, he or she is also the creator of his or her own morality, character, state of psyche, and of his or her "I" consciousness, and therefore entire personality. On the 21st day after conception, the spirit enters the body of the newly created human being and begins to enliven it, which results in the heart beginning to beat and all bodily functions taking up their work, including the brain. From this moment, not only the basic personality of the human being begins to evolve, rather also the basic character and the basic form of the psyche. Thereby, from the 21st day after conception, the entire human body, with all its functions, forms into a vason, which also becomes conscious of itself, and indeed because the consciousness also takes up its activity and therefore begins to think. And exactly that is the process which is necessary for becoming conscious of oneself, and from which the actual personality forms. In this early process of development, step by step, combinations of circumstances are attracted which are interpreted by the consciousness and which are the reflection of its own negative or positive, its good or bad, and of its strengths or weaknesses. Thus, the human being already forms his or her basic personality in the womb, just as he or she also forms his or her basic character at this time, as well as his or her morality and the state of his or her psyche. And in this form, everything actually forms according to the circumstances which influence it, which create stimulation for certain lines of thought, which in turn cause certain effects in regard to the forming of the morality, character, psyche, and personality, even though the newly developing human being is so small and innocent. Thus, at birth, when there are basic characteristics already present, then these were already formed with the development of the human being in the womb, simply through the might of the thoughts of the developing human being. Therefore, it is erroneous to assume that the newly conceived life lives without thoughts during the 9-month period of human development in the womb, and that it does not develop greatly, or does not develop at all, in regard to its own entire personality, as well as in regard to its character, morality, and psyche, because that allegedly only happens after the birth. This claim corresponds not only to a fallacy, rather to an irrational teaching and wrong representation. As a matter of fact, thoughts pertaining to profound learning and the forming of personality, as well as the forming of morality and the psyche, and the basic character, are, namely, already maintained by the developing human being in the womb, and are no less mightful than those thoughts which are thought later, after the birth and during the life. The volition of the human being is not significant if the corresponding thoughts do not mightfully realize the volition. It is basically true that the human being attracts that which he or she is. All quirks, inclinations, wishes, desires, and ziele, or goals, can be changed and thwarted by the might of the thoughts, when the thoughts are given a corresponding direction and are awarded the necessary power. The direction of the thoughts is thereby determined by the consciousness, stimulated by its impulsations, intuitions, inspirations, and ideas. Therefore, the consciousness forms the innermost thoughts, which further develop by means of its power, and which, in practice, nourish themselves, and indeed, toward the good or evil, or the negative or positive. The human being thereby becomes the creator of his or her own destiny, entirely according to the aphorism, quote, "God helps those who help themselves." In this sense, quote, God is he or she who forms the human being's destiny, the human being himself or herself. And this, quote, God is the inner self from which the thoughts, with their might, are created. Therefore, the human being, himself or herself, creates, through the might of his or her thoughts, every one of his or her own states, regardless of whether it is a state of actual inner freedom or a negative state of inner imprisonment. Through his or her thinking alone, the human being determines whether he or she stagnates or evolves. The thoughts and the actions and formations which result from them are the formers and guardians of one's own destiny. They hold the human being prisoner when they are of a low, negative nature, and they create and give freedom, peace, love, and harmony when they are good, positive, and equalized. Regarded in this sense, the human being receives not simply that for which he or she wishes or for which he or she prays, rather always that which he or she produces and earns with the form of his or her thoughts. If, for example, wishes and prayers are only directed at yielding quick success or profit, or at only being used in times of hardship, without the thoughts and actions, as well as the formations, being continually and correctly maintained and practiced, then only negative effects or no effects at all can come about. Wishes and prayers are truthfully only fulfilled and answered when they are identical to the thoughts, actions, and formations, and to the harmonization. Wishes and prayers are never petitions to a god or a saint. Rather, they are thoughts generated by oneself, which are fed back out of the consciousness and inner self to one's own consciousness and inner self, to thereby create a fulfillment. If wishes and prayers are directed in this way at one's own consciousness and inner self, and the thoughts and actions are thereby identically maintained, then a success of the fulfillment is also granted. This is quite the opposite to directing wishes and prayers at a divinity or a saint. In this form, the human being, namely, is and remains a prisoner of his or her thoughts and of himself or herself, and cannot hope for the realization of his or her wishes and prayers. The human being only obtains true inner freedom when he or she is conscious of the might of his or her own thoughts and of the fact that he or she is always and in every case master of his or her own destiny, and always therefore determines and forms this himself or herself precisely through the might of his or her thoughts. This is an irrevocable, profound truth, which also, however, allows it to be recognized that the human being has to constantly battle against many kinds of circumstances in his or her life. But what does that mean in light of the truth, other than that one constantly revolts against an effect, while at the same time the cause is nourished, tended, and maintained the whole time in the consciousness by the thoughts? This cause can be extremely manifold, and can have a form which can be of a conscious as well as unconscious nature. Begun by unconscious weaknesses and quirks, it can extend to conscious vices, criminal ambitions, and human disdaining Ausartungen. But no matter what the causes are, they prevent or delay, extraordinarily stubbornly, the human being's efforts to become master of them and to find a suitable way to dismantle them or to avoid them. And viewed in this relationship, the fact is that most human beings want to improve their life circumstances, however, they are in no way willing to change themselves. The reason for that simply lies in the fact that, while better life circumstances are indeed desired, one does not want to make allowance for the effort for that, for a change in oneself in all necessary realms. To monitor the thoughts and to direct them in a neutral, positive, equalized way is for many already a work of self-violation, for which reason it is studiously refrained from. And since the human being thinks in this way, he or she remains bound and a prisoner of himself or herself, without making an effort to create an effective inner freedom. However, if the human being does not shrink back from an honest self-examination, then, in his or her finding of inner freedom and finding of self, he or she will recognize and reach a zeal, or goal, for which the entire innermost nature yearns. And that goes for all realms of life. Thus, for the purely external and material matters, as well as for the things of the inner self, of the consciousness, the psyche, the morality, the character, and fundamentally, naturally, the spirit, which, as the highest of the creational goods, and as a tiny fragment of the creation itself, enlivens the human body. Even if it were the human being's single zeal to only live for pleasure, to live an existence in laziness, or to only accumulate wealth. He or she would have to be ready to make great personal sacrifices in order to be able to reach his or her zeal. But personal commitment and efforts are also required even more of those human beings who strive for a life which is strong and well-rounded, full of peace, love, equalizedness, freedom, and harmony.